The radio crackled to life at 0300 hours. Staff Sergeant Michael Brennan, 5th Special Forces Group, reached for the handset in the operations room at Nui Dat, expecting another routine coordination request. What he heard instead would end his willingness to work with Australian forces for the remainder of his tour. The Australian SAS patrol leader's voice came through crisp and composed, almost casual. They had eyes on a Viet Cong staging area. 15 confirmed enemy. Request for immediate artillery support denied. They would handle it themselves. 5 men against 15. Brennan tried to argue. The Australians cut the transmission. 6 hours later, they called for extraction. All 15 enemy eliminated. 0 Australian casualties. 0 shots heard beyond a 100-meter radius. And you know what the after-action report said? Americans make too much noise. We had to do it ourselves. Wait, the Australians said what? The guys who showed up in Vietnam, with barely 150 operators total. The force so small they didn't even register on most American organizational charts. Those Australians had the nerve to call the most powerful military on Earth too loud, too stupid, too predictable to operate with. Oh, this story gets so much deeper than professional rivalry, because what unfolded in the jungles of Phuoc Tuy Province between 1966 and 1971 was not just a clash of tactics, but a collision of military culture so fundamental that it would expose cracks in American doctrine that the Pentagon spent decades trying to ignore. You're about to discover why American Special Forces operators, men who had survived multiple tours and earned every combat decoration short of the Medal of Honor, started requesting transfers just to avoid joint operations with the Australians. And trust me, by the end of this video, you'll understand why one Green Beret captain submitted a report that got immediately classified at MACV headquarters. His assessment of Australian methods? They don't fight like soldiers. They hunt like animals. And they're better at it than we'll ever be. Stay with me. The 1st Australian SAS squadron touched down at Vung Tau in June of 1966. 3rd Squadron, Special Air Service Regiment, consisted of 120 men rotating from their base in Perth, Western Australia. American liaison officers at the 1st Australian Task Force headquarters studied the unit roster with barely concealed skepticism. The Australians were bringing 1 squadron, to fight in a war that had already consumed over 200,000 American troops with no end in sight. The American assessment was polite but dismissive, a nice gesture from an allied nation, a token force that would provide minimal combat capability while allowing Australia to claim it was supporting the war effort. The Australians could handle some basic reconnaissance work, maybe run a few patrols in the safer areas around their base at Nui Dat, stay out of the way while the real war was fought by real soldiers with real firepower. This assessment would prove catastrophically wrong in ways that American military planners could never have anticipated. The problem began with assumptions. American Special Operations in Vietnam in 1966 operated according to doctrine refined through 2 world wars and Korea. Find the enemy. Fix them in position with superior firepower. Destroy them with overwhelming force. This methodology had crushed the Imperial Japanese Army across the Pacific. It had stopped the Chinese advance in Korea. It had won every conventional conflict America had fought for 20 years. But Vietnam was not a conventional conflict, and the Viet Cong were not a conventional enemy. They had spent years studying American tactics, learning to recognize the signatures of American operations from miles away. The distinctive thump of Huey helicopters announcing insertions, the radio chatter that filled the airwaves before, during, and after every mission, the predictable patrol patterns that followed terrain features and avoided difficult approaches. Against such an enemy, American methodology had a fatal flaw. You cannot destroy what you cannot catch, and you cannot catch an enemy who hears you coming from 5 kilometers away. The Australians operated under no such constraints. Their doctrine had been forged, not in the massive industrial warfare of the world wars, but in the intimate violence of jungle counterinsurgency. The Malayan emergency from 1948 to 1960 had taught Australian forces that patience outweighed firepower. The Indonesian confrontation from 1963 to 1966 had refined those lessons into something approaching art. Small patrols, absolute silence, days or weeks in the bush without support, the willingness to spend 20 hours observing an enemy position before engaging, the understanding that the jungle itself could be a weapon more powerful than artillery if you learn to become part of it. These were not abstract principles. They were survival skills learned through trial and terrible error in terrain that killed the careless and rewarded the patient. And when 3rd Squadron arrived in Vietnam, they brought those skills with them. The first joint operation between American and Australian Special Forces occurred in July of 1966. Captain James Morrison, a MAC-V SOG liaison officer with 18 months in country and a Silver Star from previous operations, accompanied an Australian 5-man patrol into the northern approaches near Bin Ba. Morrison had worked with Special Forces teams from 3 different groups, had trained with British SAS in Malaysia, considered himself reasonably knowledgeable about small unit operations. The Australian patrol departed at 0300 hours, moving on foot through 12 kilometers of mixed rubber plantation and jungle fringe. Morrison noted immediately that something was different. There was no talking, no hand signals, no sound whatsoever. The patrol leader, a lieutenant whose name Morrison never learned, communicated through touches. A hand on the shoulder meant stop. Pressure on the arm indicated direction. Signals so subtle Morrison missed half of them in the darkness. By dawn, they had established an observation position overlooking a trail intersection that intelligence suggested served as a courier route for D445 Provincial Battalion. What Morrison witnessed over the next 18 hours would fundamentally alter his understanding of special operations warfare. The Australians did not set up a conventional ambush. They did not dig fighting positions or establish overlapping fields of fire. Instead, 4 men melted into the undergrowth on either side of the trail, while the 5th moved forward to examine the path itself. For 20 minutes, this soldier studied the trail, occasionally lowering his face to within centimeters of the ground, touching vegetation, sniffing the air. When he returned, he whispered something to the patrol leader that Morrison could not hear despite being less than 2 meters away. The patrol leader nodded. The Australians repositioned with movement so slow it seemed almost geological. 11 hours later, 3 Viet Cong couriers walked directly into the kill zone. The engagement lasted 4 seconds, 3 enemy eliminated, 0 Australian casualties, 0 shots that could be heard beyond 50 meters. Morrison's after-action report noted the clinical efficiency of the ambush, but what disturbed him came after. Standard American doctrine called for immediate extraction following enemy contact. Get in, hit hard, get out before reinforcements arrived. The Australians remained in position for another 6 hours. At 14:30 hours, a 7-man Viet Cong search team arrived to investigate when the couriers failed to report. they found their comrades arranged in a specific pattern Morrison would later describe as ritualistic. The 3 dead couriers had been positioned sitting upright against trees, their weapons placed across their laps as if resting. A playing card, the ace of spades, had been tucked into each man's collar. The psychological effect on the search team was immediate and visible. Even from 50 meters away, Morrison could see terror in their movements. One soldier vomited. Another fired blindly into the jungle, emptying his magazine at shadows. The Australians watched all of this without engaging, observing as the Viet Cong collected their dead and retreated at twice the speed they had arrived, abandoning all tactical discipline. Morrison concluded his classified report with an observation that would echo through intelligence assessments for years. Australian SAS does not conduct ambushes. They conduct psychological warfare operations using enemy bodies as the primary medium of communication. Effectiveness unprecedented. Personal recommendation: I do not wish to participate in future joint operations. Morrison's report reached the desk of every senior Special Operations commander in MACV. The responses divided along predictable lines. Some officers recognized the implications immediately. If a 5-man patrol could achieve results that required an American company to replicate, if psychological operations could degrade enemy effectiveness more efficiently than firepower, then perhaps American doctrine needed fundamental revision. Other officers reacted with barely concealed hostility. The Australian methods were described as unprofessional, borderline violations of the laws of war, incompatible with American military values. One colonel from 5th Special Forces Group submitted a counter-assessment arguing that such tactics might work for a tiny force operating in a limited area, but could never be scaled to the operational requirements of American forces in Vietnam. The debate never reached resolution because events overtook it. By September of 1966, 3rd Squadron had conducted 73 patrols throughout Phuoc Tuy Province. Their intelligence gathering had proven so valuable that 1st Australian Task Force Headquarters began receiving requests from American commanders for Australian reconnaissance teams to operate in areas where American LRRP teams had failed to gather actionable intelligence. The requests were polite. The subtext was clear. Send your SAS where our long-range reconnaissance patrols cannot operate. The Australians agreed. What followed would cement their reputation and deepen the divide between Australian and American special operations methodology. In October, an Australian patrol inserted into the Mai Tao Mountains, a Viet Cong stronghold that B-52 strikes had pounded for months without degrading enemy operations. The patrol consisted of 5 men. They carried rations for 14 days, minimal equipment, weapons selected for reliability over firepower. American observers at the helicopter insertion noted that the Australians looked more like bushwalkers than soldiers, canvas sneakers instead of jungle boots, faded uniforms with no rank insignia, personal weapons that seemed almost antiquated compared to American kit. One operator carried a sawed-off shotgun. Another had what appeared to be a World War II-era Owen submachine gun. The Americans watched the helicopter disappear into the mountains and gave the patrol 3 days before they'd be calling for emergency extraction. 14 days later, the patrol called for pickup. They brought with them intelligence that filled 70 pages of typed reports, detailed maps of Viet Cong tunnel networks, supply routes, cache locations, troop movements, information that American intelligence had been trying to acquire for 8 months. 0 contact with the enemy, 0 detection, The enemy never knew the Australians had been there. When American intelligence officers asked how they had achieved such results, the patrol leader's answer was blunt. "We didn't announce our presence with helicopter noise and radio chatter. We walked in from 12 kilometers away. We moved like the jungle belonged to us. We made the enemy think they were safe." The American response was predictable. Such methods took too long, required too much patience, could not be replicated by conventional forces. The Australians shrugged. They had never claimed their methods could be scaled. They were showing what was possible when you abandoned the assumption that bigger was better. The tension between American and Australian approaches crystallized around a fundamental question. What was special operations supposed to achieve? American Doctrine in 1966 emphasized decisive action, engage the enemy, destroy enemy forces, achieve measurable results that could be quantified in after-action reports. Body counts, weapons captured, terrain seized. Australian Doctrine emphasized something entirely different. Dominate the enemy psychologically, make them afraid to patrol, make them question every shadow, make them believe the jungle itself had turned against them, achieve strategic effects through terror rather than attrition. These were not complementary philosophies. They were competing visions of warfare that could not coexist without friction, and as joint operations increased, that friction became impossible to ignore. Navy SEAL Roger Hayden experienced this friction firsthand during a 10-day mission with Australian SAS in the Umin Forest during late 1967. Hayden, assigned to SEAL Team 1 with 2 previous tours and extensive reconnaissance experience, volunteered for the joint operation partly out of curiosity. He had heard stories about Australian methods. He wanted to see if the reputation was deserved. The patrol lasted 10 days. During that entire period, the Australians did not speak a single word. Communication occurred through hand and arm signals so subtle Hayden admitted he missed most of them. Movement through the jungle was so slow, so deliberate, that hours would pass covering distances an American patrol would traverse in minutes. But the results were undeniable. The Australians located 3 Viet Cong base camps, mapped supply routes, observed enemy movements from positions so close Hayden could smell the cooking fires, all without detection, all without firing a shot. When Hayden returned to his unit, he submitted a report that would be cited in SEAL training materials for decades. In underwater demolition teams, you just don't have the fieldcraft to be out in the jungle looking for people. Australian fieldcraft was so good you had to have your act together. According to Hayden, SEALs lost a lot of men because of lack of fieldcraft preparation. The Australians had something American special operations lacked, not better equipment, not superior firepower, something more fundamental, an understanding that the jungle was not the enemy's weapon, but could be yours if you were willing to become something other than a conventional soldier. But Hayden's positive assessment was not universal. Other American special operators who worked with Australians came away disturbed by what they witnessed. The methods were effective, yes, but they crossed lines that American military culture was not prepared to cross. Staff Sergeant David Walsh, assigned to 5th Special Forces Group, participated in a joint operation with 2nd Squadron SAS in the Long High Hills during March of 1968. The mission brief was straightforward. Locate and observe Viet Cong positions, gather intelligence, avoid contact if possible. The Australian patrol leader, a captain whose name Walsh never recorded, laid out different rules. If we make contact, we finish it. No prisoners, no survivors, No evidence we were here except bodies arranged to send a message. Walsh's objection was immediate. American rules of engagement required accepting enemy surrender, treating prisoners according to Geneva Conventions, conducting operations within legal and moral constraints. The Australian captain listened politely, then explained that those constraints got soldiers killed in jungles where the enemy showed no such restraint. The patrol would operate according to Australian methods, or the Americans could stay behind. Walsh went along. What he witnessed over the next 6 days would haunt him for decades. The patrol located a Viet Cong sentry position on the third night. 2 soldiers manning an observation post overlooking a supply trail. Standard American doctrine would have been to observe, document radio intelligence back to headquarters. The Australians had different ideas. The patrol leader sent 2 men forward. They moved through darkness with such silence that Walsh, watching from 20 meters away, could not hear them approach the enemy position. The sentries never raised an alarm. The 2 Australians returned 15 minutes later. The patrol leader used hand signals to indicate they were moving out. Walsh asked what happened to the sentries. The Australian response was delivered in a whisper so cold it made Walsh's blood freeze. Sentries are sleeping. Permanently. They won't wake up. And their friends will find them in the morning, arranged in a way that will make them think twice about accepting sentry duty in this area again. Walsh's after-action report, submitted through classified channels, concluded with a personal assessment that perfectly captured the divide between Australian and American special operations culture. The Australians are the most effective operators I have ever worked with. They are also the most disturbing. They do not see themselves as soldiers conducting military operations. They see themselves as hunters, and in hunting there is no such thing as a fair fight. By mid-1968, the pattern had become clear. Australian SAS was achieving results that American special operations could not match, not because of superior equipment or training, but because of fundamental differences in operational philosophy. Where Americans announced their presence with helicopter insertions, the Australians walked in from kilometers away. Where Americans relied on radio communications, the Australians maintained absolute noise discipline. Where Americans sought decisive engagements, the Australians emphasized patience and psychological dominance. The kill ratio told the story. Australian SAS in Vietnam achieved ratios exceeding 30-1 by some estimates. American MACV average kill ratio hovered around 7-1. Conventional infantry averaged approximately 1-1. These numbers were not classified secrets. They were documented facts that every intelligence officer could access, and they raised an uncomfortable question that American military leadership could not easily answer. If a force of 150 Australians could achieve better results than American battalions 10 times their size, what did that say about American doctrine? The Pentagon's response was telling. Rather than acknowledge the implications, senior commanders focused on explaining why Australian methods could not work for American forces. The Australians operated in a single province with clear boundaries. Americans had responsibility for the entire country. Australian patrols could spend weeks in the field without support. American operations required coordination with larger units. Australian methods emphasized stealth and patience. American doctrine required decisive action and measurable results. These were not wrong observations. They were rationalizations designed to protect institutional assumptions from uncomfortable truths. The real reason American forces could not adopt Australian methods had nothing to do with operational requirements and everything to do with organizational culture. American military institutions in 1968 were designed for conventional warfare scaled to industrial dimensions, thousands of soldiers supported by overwhelming firepower, achieving objectives through mass and momentum. The entire structure of command, logistics, training, and doctrine assumed this model. Special operations existed as specialized tools within this framework, but they still operated according to fundamentally conventional assumptions. Find, fix, destroy, measure success in quantifiable terms, maintain command and control through radio networks. The Australians rejected these assumptions entirely. They treated special operations not as specialized conventional warfare, but as an entirely different category of conflict requiring entirely different mindsets. The cultural divide manifested in countless small ways that accumulated into fundamental incompatibility. American helicopter pilots complained that Australian insertion requests were needlessly complicated. The Australians wanted multiple false insertions, wanted helicopters to touch down in locations where patrols would not actually dismount, wanted flight patterns designed to confuse enemy observers. American pilots, trained to maximize efficiency and minimize exposure to ground fire, saw these requests as paranoid overcomplications. Australian patrol leaders, trained to assume the enemy was always watching, saw American efficiency as suicidal predictability. American intelligence officers grew frustrated with Australian reporting. The Australians would spend 2 weeks gathering intelligence and return with detailed observations, but no quantifiable results. No body count, no weapons captured, no infrastructure destroyed. Just pages of notes about enemy patterns, behaviors, psychological states. American intelligence wanted hard data that could feed into operations planning. Australian intelligence provided subtle observations about enemy morale and habits that could not be easily quantified but proved devastatingly effective when properly utilized. American logisticians struggled with Australian supply requests. The Australians wanted minimal resupply, often operating for weeks on rations that American quartermasters considered inadequate. They modified equipment in ways that violated American procedures, cut the soles from their boots to reduce noise and alter their footprint signature, removed rank insignia and unit patches from uniforms, carried weapons selected for reliability over standardization. From an American institutional perspective, these modifications represented lack of discipline and disregard for proper procedures. From an Australian perspective, institutional procedures that prioritized uniformity over effectiveness were exactly what got soldiers killed in environments where adaptation meant survival. But the deepest source of tension was not tactical or logistical, it was moral. Australian psychological operations crossed lines that American military culture in 1968 was not prepared to cross. The body display doctrine had no official name in Australian military documentation. It existed in classified annexes of after-action reports, in whispered conversations among men who had witnessed it, in the nightmares of Viet Cong soldiers who survived encounters with what they called Ma Rung, the jungle ghosts. The principle was elegant and disturbing. Every engagement with the enemy was an opportunity for communication. Not communication with headquarters, communication with the enemy themselves. And the most powerful message that could be sent was one that exploited the deepest fears of Vietnamese peasant soldiers raised on folk tales of forest spirits and vengeful ghosts. Australian SAS operators did not simply kill enemy soldiers. They staged their deaths, bodies positioned to suggest supernatural intervention, weapons arranged to indicate the victim had seen something terrible in final moments. Playing cards, the ace of spades, which Vietnamese superstition associated with death omens, left as calling cards. In some cases, operators infiltrated enemy positions at night and left signs of their presence without engaging. Footprints that appeared from nowhere and led to nothing. Equipment rearranged while guards slept. Messages scratched into tree bark. The effect on Viet Cong morale was measurable and devastating. Political officers reported increasing difficulty maintaining unit cohesion in areas where Australian SAS operated. Desertion rates spiked. Soldiers refused night patrol assignments. Some units began conducting elaborate spiritual rituals before entering zones where the phantoms were known to operate. Captured documents from D445 Battalion revealed an organization descending into collective paranoia. Entry from November 3, 1968. 3 comrades failed to return from water collection. Search found no bodies, no blood, no evidence of contact. Political officer suspects desertion. Commander believes otherwise. Entry from November 7th. Sentry Position 4 reported presence in jungle at 0200 hours. Flare illumination revealed nothing. Sentry found at dawn, throat cut. No sound heard by adjacent positions 15 meters away. Entry from November 12th. Movement restricted to daylight hours only. Commander requests reinforcement from 274th Regiment. Request denied. Area considered secure from American operations, but the area was not secure from Australian operations. American liaison officers who witnessed these methods reacted with a mixture of admiration and revulsion. The effectiveness could not be denied. One captured Viet Cong political officer, in testimony circulated at the highest levels of American command, stated that his unit had received explicit orders to avoid contact with Australian forces at all costs, not because they were numerous or well armed, but because they could not be found, could not be fixed, could not be engaged on terms that offered any chance of survival. His exact words, translated from Vietnamese: "The Americans we can defeat. They are predictable. They are loud. They depend on machines. The Australians are different. They live in the jungle like we do. But they are not like us. They are something worse." This testimony validated everything the Australians were doing. It proved that psychological operations targeting enemy morale could achieve strategic effects disproportionate to resources invested. But it also raised questions about compliance with laws of armed conflict, about proportionality, about treatment of enemy dead. The Australians listened politely to these concerns and continued doing exactly what they had been doing. By 1969, the divide between American and Australian special operations had hardened into mutual incomprehension. American officers viewed Australian methods as effective, but ultimately unsuitable for American forces, too small-scale, too dependent on individual initiative, too willing to operate outside conventional constraints. Australian officers viewed American methods as needlessly complicated, overly reliant on technology and firepower, fundamentally unsuited to the intimate violence of jungle warfare. Neither side was entirely wrong. The Australians had developed methodology optimized for small unit operations in specific terrain against specific enemies. American forces were trying to fight a war that required coordination across an entire country, with forces numbering in the hundreds of thousands. These were genuinely different operational problems that might genuinely require different solutions, but institutional pride prevented honest assessment. American commanders could not publicly acknowledge that a tiny Allied force had developed capabilities American forces lacked. That acknowledgement would have raised too many uncomfortable questions about American doctrine, American training, American institutional assumptions about how wars should be fought. The final American assessment of Australian SAS operations in Vietnam would not be completed until 1974, 3 years after the last Australian combat troops departed. Classified top secret and distributed to fewer than 50 recipients, the report reached conclusions that contradicted everything American military doctrine assumed about counterinsurgency warfare. First, small unit operations conducted by highly trained personnel achieved better results than large unit operations supported by overwhelming firepower. The Australian SAS kill ratio of 17-1, as documented in the report, compared favorably to MACV average of approximately 7-1 and conventional infantry average of approximately 1-1. Second, indigenous tracking methods, specifically Aboriginal techniques adapted to jungle warfare, provided intelligence capabilities that no technological system could replicate. Third, psychological warfare operations targeting enemy morale could achieve strategic effects disproportionate to resources invested. A single 5-man patrol operating for 2 weeks could degrade enemy effectiveness more than a battalion-sized sweep and clear operation. Fourth, and most controversially, Australian methods achieved these results while operating under significantly fewer restrictions than American forces. The classified annex noted that certain Australian practices regarding treatment of enemy dead and conduct of psychological operations would likely violate standing MACV directives if conducted by United States personnel. This final point ensured the report remained classified for decades. The Pentagon had no interest in publicizing that their most effective allies in Vietnam had succeeded partly by doing things American forces were prohibited from doing. The political implications were dangerous. The moral implications were uncomfortable. Better to let the Australian contribution fade into historical obscurity, remembered only by veterans who had served alongside them and intelligence officers who studied their methods in classified seminars that would never be publicly acknowledged. But lessons learned have a way of surviving institutional amnesia. In the decades following Vietnam, fragments of the Australian SAS story began emerging through veteran memoirs, declassified documents, academic research. Each revelation added another piece to a puzzle that contradicted official narratives. What became clear was that the Australians had not simply executed effective special operations, they had demonstrated an entirely different approach to unconventional warfare that challenged fundamental assumptions about how modern militaries should function. The transformation that made Australian effectiveness possible was not replicable through doctrine or training alone. It required psychological adaptation that American military culture in 1968 could not accommodate. Australian SAS selection began not with physical tests, but with psychological evaluation. Candidates were assessed for specific personality profiles: high pain tolerance, low need for social validation, above-average pattern recognition, and what psychologists termed predatory patience, the ability to remain motionless for hours while maintaining complete situational awareness, the willingness to act with explosive violence after extended periods of inactivity, the capacity to function independently in environments where help was days away. Only 1 in 12 candidates who began selection completed it. Those who passed entered training that lasted 18 months, 3 times longer than United States Army Special Forces training of the same era. And significant portions of that training took place not in jungle warfare schools, but in the Australian outback, learning tracking techniques from Aboriginal instructors whose methods had never been written down, whose knowledge had been passed through generations stretching back 40,000 years. This was the secret American Special Operations could observe but never truly replicate. The Australians were not simply better trained soldiers. They had undergone transformation into something fundamentally different. Men who could track prey through jungle so dense that infrared sensors registered nothing but green blur, who could determine the age of a footprint to within 6 hours by moisture content of disturbed vegetation, who could smell a Vietnamese soldier's rice and fish sauce diet from 400 meters downwind. These were not skills that could be taught in 18-month courses. They were capabilities that emerged from cultural traditions and psychological adaptations that American military institutions had no framework to reproduce. Aboriginal trackers brought to Vietnam represented knowledge systems developed over millennia of survival in some of Earth's most unforgiving environments. Private Dorian Walker, a Pentubi man from the western desert, could navigate terrain that defeated Western soldiers equipped with the latest navigation technology. He could read signs in jungle undergrowth that were invisible to observers standing next to him. He could distinguish between disturbances caused by animals, by weather, by human passage hours, or days old. This was not magic or supernatural ability. It was profound attunement to environment developed through cultures that had made such attunement prerequisite for survival. American Special Operations in the decades after Vietnam attempted to incorporate lessons from Australian methodology, the emphasis on small unit tactics, the importance of patience and observation, the value of psychological operations. Modern Special Forces selection and training shows clear influence from Australian approaches, but something essential was lost in translation. American military institutions could replicate Australian tactics, but struggled to replicate Australian psychology. The transformation that turns ordinary men into what the Viet Cong called jungle ghosts, the willingness to become something other than conventional soldiers, the acceptance that effective hunting requires becoming a hunter not in technique but in soul. This was the unbridgeable gap that made Australian effectiveness simultaneously admirable and unreplicatable from American perspective. The story of American Special Forces' complex relationship with Australian SAS in Vietnam reveals uncomfortable truths about military effectiveness and institutional resistance to change. When a tiny Allied force achieves better results than massive American deployments, institutional response should be to learn, adapt, incorporate successful methods into broader doctrine. Instead, the response was to explain why those methods could not work for American forces, to emphasize differences rather than similarities, to protect institutional assumptions from evidence that contradicted them. This was not malice or incompetence. It was natural organizational behavior. Large institutions resist fundamental change because change threatens the structures, procedures, and assumptions that give institutions coherence and identity. The American military in Vietnam was not prepared to abandon assumptions about firepower, technology, and conventional methodology that had worked successfully in previous conflicts. That those assumptions were failing in Vietnam did not automatically mean they should be abandoned. It meant they should be applied with more resources, more determination, more commitment. This institutional logic explains why American strategy in Vietnam kept escalating rather than adapting, kept adding more troops and more firepower rather than questioning whether more was actually better. The Australians offered an alternative: small units operating with minimal support, achieving disproportionate results through patience, fieldcraft, and psychological dominance. But accepting that alternative would have required American institutions to acknowledge that bigger was not always better, that technology could not substitute for adaptability, that overwhelming firepower could not compensate for strategic and tactical errors. These acknowledgments were too painful, too threatening to institutional identity. So the Australian example was studied in classified channels, discussed in specialized communities, but never allowed to fundamentally challenge American doctrine. The war ended before these tensions could be resolved. American withdrawal, followed by North Vietnamese victory, swept away the local arrangements that Australians had so carefully constructed in Phuoc Tuy province. But for those who were there, for soldiers and commanders and intelligence officers who witnessed what 150 men accomplished, the memory remained. It remained as challenge to comfortable assumptions, as proof that another way was possible, as demonstration that effectiveness in unconventional warfare required unconventional thinking. Private Dorian Walker returned to Australia in 1970 and never served in military again. He spent his remaining years in the Western Desert, living among his people, never speaking about what he had done in Vietnam. When researchers attempted to interview him for academic studies of Aboriginal contributions to the war effort, he refused. That knowledge belongs to the jungle, he reportedly told one persistent historian. It stays there. Captain Roger Hayden continued his Navy SEAL career, eventually retiring as a senior chief and becoming an instructor. He spent decades teaching reconnaissance and fieldcraft, always crediting his 10 days with Australian SAS as the most valuable training he ever received. He would tell students that Australian fieldcraft was so good you had to have your act together, that SEALs lost men because of lack of fieldcraft preparation, that learning to move through hostile terrain without detection was more important than any weapon or technology. Staff Sergeant David Walsh completed his tour with 5th Special Forces Group, returned to United States, and never spoke publicly about his experiences with Australian SAS. His after-action reports survived in classified archives, testament to methods that American military doctrine was not prepared to adopt and Australian authorities were not prepared to acknowledge. The classified reports, the whispered stories, the veteran accounts that accumulated over decades paint a picture of special operations at a crossroads. On one side, American methodology, emphasizing firepower, technology, decisive action, quantifiable results. On the other side, Australian methodology emphasizing stealth, patience, psychological dominance, effects that could not be easily measured but proved devastatingly effective. These were not simply different tactics. They were competing visions of what warfare could be in an age when conventional assumptions no longer guaranteed victory. The American vision ultimately failed in Vietnam, not because American soldiers lacked courage or skill, but because institutional assumptions about how wars should be fought proved inadequate to the reality of counterinsurgency in dense jungle against an enemy who had spent years learning to exploit American predictability. The Australian vision succeeded in limited scope, pacifying a single province through methods that larger forces could not replicate. But that success raised questions that American institutions were not prepared to answer. Questions about whether small could be better than large, whether patience could outweigh firepower, whether psychological dominance could achieve strategic objectives that attrition could not. These questions remain relevant today as military forces worldwide grapple with similar challenges in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and countless other theaters where conventional assumptions about warfare prove inadequate. Modern special operations incorporate many lessons that Australians demonstrated in Vietnam. Small unit tactics, emphasis on cultural understanding, recognition that psychological effects can outweigh physical destruction. But institutional resistance to fundamental change persists. Large military organizations are still designed for conventional operations, still measure success in quantifiable terms, still struggle to accommodate unconventional thinking that challenges established doctrine. The Australian SAS in Vietnam represented what was possible when a force was willing to abandon conventional assumptions entirely, to embrace methods that prioritized effectiveness over procedure, to become something other than conventional soldiers operating in unconventional circumstances. That example remains simultaneously inspiring and threatening to military institutions worldwide. Inspiring because it demonstrates what small, highly trained forces can achieve when freed from conventional constraints. Threatening because accepting that demonstration requires acknowledging that much of what institutions assume about warfare may be wrong. 50 years after the last Australian combat troops departed Vietnam, the lessons remain relevant and largely unlearned. Special Operations Forces worldwide study Australian methodology in Vietnam. The psychological operations, the tracking techniques, the emphasis on patience and stealth. But studying is not the same as understanding, and understanding is not the same as implementing. The transformation that made Australian effectiveness possible, the willingness to become hunters rather than soldiers, the acceptance that effectiveness might require abandoning comfortable institutional assumptions, these remain beyond reach of most military organizations. Perhaps that is inevitable. Perhaps large institutions cannot function without the stability that comes from established procedures and conventional assumptions. Perhaps the Australian example works precisely because it was small, specialized, operating outside normal constraints. Or perhaps the real lesson is more uncomfortable. Perhaps military effectiveness in modern unconventional conflicts requires abandoning many assumptions that 20th century military institutions were built upon. Perhaps bigger is not better. Firepower cannot substitute for adaptability. Technology cannot compensate for cultural understanding and tactical patience. Perhaps the Australians were right, and American institutional response was wrong. These are the questions that classified reports could not answer, that veteran accounts hint at but cannot resolve, that continue to challenge military thinking decades after the Vietnam War ended. The story of why American Special Forces had such complex reactions to Australian SAS in Vietnam is ultimately a story about institutions confronting evidence that contradicts their foundational assumptions. It is a story about the gap between what works and what institutions are prepared to accept. It is a story about how military effectiveness sometimes requires abandoning everything comfortable in pursuit of adaptation. The Australians showed it was possible. American institutions showed how difficult it is to accept such demonstrations when they threaten too much of what makes institutions function. The tension between these positions never resolved. It simply ended when the war ended, leaving lessons learned but not fully absorbed, methods studied but not truly replicated, questions raised but never satisfactorily answered. And somewhere in the jungles of what was once Phuoc Toi province, now returned to silence and obscurity, the ghosts of those lessons still linger, waiting for military institutions willing to learn what the Australians tried to teach, waiting for forces prepared to become not just soldiers executing unconventional tactics, but hunters who understand that effectiveness in modern warfare might require transformation that comfortable assumptions cannot accommodate. The classified files remain locked in archives. The veterans who witnessed these events grow older, their memories fading, their stories harder to verify. But the fundamental questions persist. What makes military forces effective in unconventional conflicts? Can institutional militaries adapt to environments that reward unconventional thinking? Can large organizations learn from small specialized units that achieve disproportionate results through methods that challenge institutional norms? The Australian SAS in Vietnam provided one set of answers. American institutional responses provided another. The gap between those answers defines tensions that special operations worldwide still navigate. Tensions between procedure and adaptation, between institutional stability and tactical flexibility, between measuring success in conventional terms and accepting that effectiveness might manifest in ways that defy easy quantification. These tensions will not resolve through doctrine or training alone. They require fundamental rethinking of what military organizations are designed to achieve and how effectiveness should be measured in conflicts that conventional assumptions cannot adequately address. The operational differences extended beyond tactics into the fundamental structure of how missions were conceived and executed. American special operations in Vietnam operated within complex command hierarchies that required multiple levels of approval for most activities. Mission planning involved detailed coordination with artillery units, air support, extraction assets, intelligence centers, and higher headquarters. Radio communications maintained constant contact between patrols and operation centers. After-action reports followed standardized formats that emphasized quantifiable metrics. This structure provided oversight and accountability. It ensured operations fit within broader strategic frameworks, but it also created predictable patterns that enemy forces learned to exploit. Viet Cong intelligence officers could often anticipate American operations by monitoring helicopter traffic, radio transmissions, and artillery preparation fires. The very systems designed to support American operations also advertised them to enemy observers who had spent years learning to recognize the signatures. Australian operations rejected this entire framework. Mission approval was decentralized to squadron level, with patrol leaders given broad latitude to execute objectives as they saw fit. Communications with higher headquarters occurred only at predetermined times, using burst transmissions that minimized radio signature. Patrols operated independently for weeks without expectation of support beyond emergency extraction. After-action reports emphasized qualitative observations about enemy morale, behavior patterns, and psychological states rather than quantifiable body counts. This structure violated every principle of American command and control doctrine. It created situations where commanders had limited visibility into what their subordinates were doing. It made coordination with larger operations difficult or impossible, but it also made Australian operations unpredictable in ways that enemy forces found deeply unsettling. Viet Cong units could anticipate American patterns. They had no framework for anticipating Australian operations that followed no discernible pattern. The difference was perhaps most visible in how the two forces approached helicopter operations. American doctrine in Vietnam relied heavily on helicopter mobility. Units inserted by air, operated for hours or days, then extracted by air. This methodology enabled rapid deployment and extraction, but created acoustic signatures audible for kilometers. The distinctive sound of Huey helicopters became so associated with American operations that Viet Cong units used it as early warning system. When helicopters appeared, enemy forces could disperse, prepare ambushes, or simply avoid the area knowing American forces would extract within predictable time frames. Australian SAS used helicopters for insertion and extraction, but approached the methodology entirely differently. Insertions occurred at dusk, using techniques designed to confuse enemy observers. Helicopters would make multiple touchdowns in different locations, with only some actually deploying patrols. Flight paths deliberately avoided direct routes to actual insertion points. Once on ground, Australian patrols would remain in place for hours to ensure helicopter noise had not attracted enemy attention before beginning movement. Extraction occurred only after patrols had moved to locations away from their operating areas, again using multiple helicopter touchdowns to obscure actual pickup points. American helicopter pilots initially resisted these procedures as unnecessarily complex and time-consuming. Squadron commanders argued that additional flight time increased exposure to ground fire and wasted resources. But Australian patrol leaders were adamant. The extra 15 or 20 minutes of helicopter operations saved days of patrol time by reducing likelihood of enemy detection. By 1969, after 5 years of SAS operations in Vietnam, Viet Cong forces had become familiar enough with Australian insertion techniques to occasionally fire on helicopters shortly after landing. The Australians adapted by introducing what they called cowboy insertions. The helicopter carrying the actual patrol was followed by a second helicopter carrying another patrol. If the first helicopter received fire after touchdown, the second patrol would deploy to assault enemy positions while the first patrol extracted. This turned potential ambushes into opportunities to catch enemy forces in exposed positions. American observers who witnessed these techniques recognized their effectiveness but struggled to implement similar procedures within American operational frameworks that emphasized standardization and efficiency over adaptability. The training pipeline differences between American and Australian special operations reflected fundamentally different philosophies about what created effective operators. American Special Forces selection in the 1960s emphasized physical capability and technical skills. Candidates underwent demanding physical tests, survival training, weapons qualification, language instruction, and specialty training in areas like demolitions or communications. The program produced technically proficient soldiers capable of training indigenous forces and conducting direct action missions, but the emphasis remained on teaching skills that could be standardized and measured. Australian SAS selection began with psychological screening, designed to identify candidates with specific personality traits: high tolerance for uncertainty and discomfort, low need for external validation or approval, ability to function independently without supervision, comfort with moral ambiguity and violence. These were not skills that could be taught. They were predispositions that selection attempted to identify. Once candidates passed initial screening, they entered training that emphasized adaptation over standardization. Rather than teaching specific techniques, Australian training exposed candidates to progressively more difficult scenarios and observed how they solved problems. Patrol through dense scrub with minimal equipment. Navigate unfamiliar terrain using only natural indicators. Survive for weeks with limited resources. Track human targets through environments where conventional tracking methods failed. Much of the advanced training occurred not in military facilities, but in the Australian outback, under instruction from Aboriginal trackers. This was the most controversial and least understood aspect of Australian training. American observers who learned of this program assumed it was cultural theatre or political gesture toward Australia's Indigenous population. The reality was far more substantive. Aboriginal Australians had developed tracking and wilderness survival capabilities over 40,000 years of continuous habitation in some of Earth's most challenging environments. These were not primitive superstitions, but sophisticated knowledge systems that Western science was only beginning to appreciate. Trackers could determine information from footprints, disturbed vegetation, animal behavior, and environmental signs that seemed almost supernatural to Western observers. They could distinguish between tracks left hours ago versus days ago by analyzing how vegetation had responded to disturbance. They could determine direction of travel, approximate weight, even emotional state of tracked individuals based on patterns invisible to untrained eyes. This knowledge had never been systematized into written doctrine or standardized procedures. It existed as cultural tradition passed through demonstration and practice across generations. When Australian SAS brought Aboriginal trackers to Vietnam, they brought knowledge systems entirely alien to Western military thinking. American special operations had no equivalent. The closest analogs were Native American trackers who had served in earlier conflicts, but that tradition had largely disappeared by Vietnam era. Some American commanders, recognizing the value of such capabilities, proposed recruiting Native American trackers for similar programs in Vietnam. The proposals went nowhere, partly due to bureaucratic obstacles, but mostly because American military institutions had no framework for integrating traditional knowledge systems into modern military operations. The assumption was that anything worth knowing could be taught through standardized training, could be documented in field manuals, could be replicated through proper instruction. Aboriginal tracking knowledge resisted all these approaches. It was too contextual, too dependent on accumulated experience, too tied to ways of perceiving environment that could not be easily taught to people raised in Western cultural frameworks. This exposed perhaps the deepest philosophical divide between American and Australian approaches. American military culture assumed warfare was fundamentally about applying technology and organization to achieve objectives. With proper equipment, proper training, proper procedures, any mission could be accomplished. Australian special operations in Vietnam demonstrated that some capabilities could not be reduced to equipment or procedures. That effectiveness sometimes required knowledge and skills that emerged from entirely different cultural traditions. That the most advanced military in the world might have things to learn from people who had never written field manual or conducted standardized training. These were uncomfortable realizations for American institutions, built on assumptions about modernity, progress, and technological superiority. Easier to dismiss Aboriginal tracking as interesting cultural artifact than to accept it as legitimate military capability that American forces lacked. The post-war legacy of Australian SAS operations in Vietnam reflected these tensions. Within Australian military, the SAS experience became foundation for modern special operations doctrine. The emphasis on small unit independence, psychological operations, and integration of traditional knowledge into modern warfare shaped how Australian Special Forces developed over subsequent decades. Operations in East Timor, Afghanistan, and Iraq showed clear lineage from methodology refined in Vietnam. But that legacy was not without controversy. As details of Australian operations in Vietnam emerged through declassified documents and veteran accounts, questions arose about methods that had proven effective but morally troubling. The psychological warfare techniques, the treatment of enemy dead, the willingness to operate outside conventional constraints. These became subjects of historical debate and ethical examination. Some argued the Australians had done what was necessary to win in an environment where conventional morality got soldiers killed. Others argued that effectiveness did not justify methods that violated standards of warfare that civilized nations should uphold. Within American military, the legacy was more complicated. On one level, Australian methods were studied extensively. Special operations schools examined Australian patrol techniques, noise discipline, psychological operations, and emphasis on intelligence gathering over direct action. Elements of Australian methodology appeared in updated American doctrine, particularly regarding long-range reconnaissance and cultural understanding. Modern American special operations show clear influence from lessons learned studying Australian operations. But on deeper level, the fundamental challenge Australian example posed to American institutional assumptions remained unresolved. The question of whether small, specialized forces could achieve better results than large conventional forces, whether patience could outweigh firepower, whether psychological effects could substitute for attrition, whether military institutions designed for conventional warfare could adapt to environments requiring unconventional thinking. These questions were acknowledged in specialized communities, but never generated institutional transformation that full acceptance would require. The individual stories of men who served with or alongside Australian SAS in Vietnam illustrate these broader tensions. Some American veterans came away convinced that Australian methods represented future of special operations, that small, highly trained units operating with maximum autonomy would prove more effective than larger forces bound by conventional procedures. They spent careers trying to push American special operations in directions informed by Australian example. Others came away disturbed by what they witnessed, convinced that Australian effectiveness came at moral costs American forces should not accept, that winning was not worth becoming the kind of hunters the Australians had proven themselves to be. Both perspectives had validity. Both reflected genuine insights about warfare, effectiveness, and moral boundaries that military forces should or should not cross. The tension between these perspectives never resolved into clear consensus. The Australian veterans carried their own burdens. Men who learned to hunt humans in Vietnamese jungles found returning to civilian life profoundly difficult. Post-traumatic stress rates among Australian Vietnam veterans eventually exceeded those of their American counterparts, despite serving in smaller numbers and sustaining fewer casualties. The same transformation that made them devastatingly effective operators made them strangers in their own communities. They had learned to think like predators. Predators do not easily return to the herd. The psychological cost of that transformation was not fully apparent until decades after the war ended, when suicide rates, divorce rates, substance abuse, and mental health struggles among Australian Vietnam veterans revealed the human price of effectiveness that military planners had not calculated. This was perhaps the most profound lesson that remained largely unlearned, that turning men into the kind of operators who could achieve what Australian SAS achieved in Vietnam required psychological changes with lasting consequences that institutions were ill-equipped to address. The technical lessons about patrol techniques and psychological operations could be studied and incorporated into doctrine. The deeper lessons about human cost of transformation remained beyond reach of institutional learning. Military organizations are designed to train soldiers, deploy them, achieve objectives, then return them to civilian life. The Australian SAS experience suggested this model might be inadequate for special operations that required not just teaching skills, but fundamentally altering how men perceived themselves and engaged with violence. That some forms of military effectiveness might create psychological adaptations incompatible with normal civilian functioning. That winning certain kinds of wars might require accepting human costs that extend far beyond battlefield casualties into the decades that follow, when veterans struggle to reintegrate into societies that have no framework for understanding what they became in service of national objectives. These were not lessons that military institutions could easily incorporate. They raised questions about whether certain missions should be undertaken if the human cost extended beyond what could be justified by strategic objectives, whether creating hunters was acceptable if those hunters could not successfully become civilians again, whether effectiveness should be measured only in operational terms or should include accounting for psychological and social costs that might not manifest for years after operations concluded. The Australian SAS veterans who struggled with these burdens did not provide clear answers. They provided evidence that questions needed to be asked, that effectiveness was more complicated than operational metrics suggested, that transformation required for maximum effectiveness might exact costs that transcended traditional military calculations of acceptable sacrifice. That rethinking has not occurred. 5 decades after Vietnam, military institutions worldwide still struggle with questions that Australian SAS operations exposed but could not answer, still try to balance conventional organizational needs with unconventional operational requirements, still seek to incorporate lessons that threaten too much of institutional identity to be fully embraced. The Australian example remains studied in specialized communities, discussed in classified seminars, referenced in training materials as demonstration of what is possible when forces abandon conventional constraints. But demonstration is not adoption. Possibility is not implementation. And the gap between what the Australians proved possible and what institutional militaries have proven willing to embrace remains as wide today as it was when Staff Sergeant Michael Brennan heard that radio transmission at 0300 hours in 1966, when Australian operators casually dismissed American support and went on to achieve results that exposed how much American special operations still had to learn about fighting wars that could not be won through firepower and conventional assumptions alone. The story of why American Special Forces had such complicated reactions to Australian SAS in Vietnam is ultimately a story that has not ended. The lessons remain incompletely learned, the questions inadequately answered, the tensions unresolved, and perhaps that is the final lesson, that some forms of military effectiveness challenge institutions so fundamentally that they can only be studied, never truly replicated, that the gap between what small specialized forces can achieve and what large institutional militaries can accommodate may be unbridgeable, that watching the Australians operate in Vietnam exposed American special operations to possibilities and limitations simultaneously, to demonstration of what could be done, and recognition of why institutional constraints might prevent American forces from doing it. Those constraints were not all bureaucratic inefficiency or institutional resistance to change. Some reflected genuine values about how military forces should operate, about moral boundaries that should not be crossed even in pursuit of effectiveness, about human costs that might not be worth strategic benefits. The Australian example did not resolve these tensions, it exposed them, and 50 years later they remain exposed, still challenging, still unresolved, still demanding answers that military institutions worldwide struggle to provide.